Hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Oreo's Master. I commonly go by Oreo or the Gumbies, and I'm here to make a Frost Mage guide for Dragonflight. So there's a few things that I'm going to be going over. I'm going to be going over the general tree talents. I'm going to be going over crafted gear, gear and trinkets that we should aim for, basically some stat prio, and then I'll be going over both single target talents and gameplay, as well as rotation, as well as M plus talents, rotation, and gameplay. So starting off, just looking at the general tree. There aren't really many things in the general tree that are needed for Frost Mage. None of it is really DPS focused in the general tree. It's a lot more utility based, but there are a few talents. So I'll be going through a breakdown of what you should be picking. So in the first section, to get our 8 points, obviously you just get the first 3. The only 2 things of damage that really matter for this first one is Overflowing Energy and then Rune of Power. Some people may want to choose Incanter's Flow versus Rune of Power, but Rune of Power is just so much more powerful than Incanter's Flow. So make sure you choose that. Other than this, we still need 4 more points to get down to the next row. So we want to take 2 points in Arcane Warding to reduce our magic damage taken. And then we want to take Author Time as well. The other talents that I would recommend you take are 2 in Tempest Barrier and then Mirror Image. And now this does go over the 8, but I'll kind of get into that further on. So now in the second talent tree, we want to take Quick-Witted, which is just reduces our interrupt when we successfully interrupt. I want to take Ice Nova, and then Tome of Ronin. This is one of the ones that's an actual damage talent here. Crit Strike by 2%. On the right side, we want to go to Master of Time, which just reduces our Alter Time cooldown, as well as it gives us a blink when we return to our original location. Blast Wave, and then Tome of Antonitis. Oh, not really sure how you say that, but another damage talent, so this increases your haste by 2%. And then this middle talent, Ice Flows or Shimmer. This is very personal preference. I've always been an Ice Flow user. A lot of people typically take Shimmer, but this is really all personal preference. There are some fights that are better for something, some dungeons that are better for one or the other, but this is all personal preference. So now after you've done those talents, there's no other talents in these that will give you any form of DPS increase, so all of this will be utility-based talents for these last 3 points. So I typically like getting a cooldown on the ones that you normally would go towards would be a cooldown in Ice Block Heal, Diverted Energy, which gives you your barriers heal for damage absorbed, and then there are some cases you'd want to take Energized Barrier. You could also take the Incantation of Swiftness, which gives your invisibility movement speed when you use it. Other than that, Remove Curse and Spellsteal are really only needed for Spellsteal is really only needed for Razageth, and Remove Curse for dungeons would only be used for Temple of the Jade Serpent, and then Spellsteal would be used for a bunch of the other dungeons. So for a general build, you probably should just take Spellsteal. It's not too big of a thing for you to be using in raid otherwise, so you don't really need it. So very generalized, I would probably go like Energized Barrier. You can probably just go 1 in each, something of that. But again, those last 3 points are really personal preference. It's all utility based. It will have no input on your damage at all. So now from here, now that we have 11 points we need to use, we want to get greater invisibility, which is very important to our survivability. And it's also just another great invis to have. And then you normally want to take Temporal Warp in raid. There are some cases you take Time Anomaly if you actually can't get full use out of Temporal Warp, but otherwise almost always take Temporal Warp. After that, you want to get Shifting Power. So you go 2 points in Frigid Winds, you get Ice Ward and Shifting Power. Shifting Powers, one is used to getting our cooldowns back, so Frozen Orb, Icy Veins, Rune of Power, those things. With Flurry, all of that. It's also really good defensively, because it can help you get back greater Invis and Mirror Image and Barrier faster, as well as Alter Time and Ice Block. So that's a very good ability for getting our cooldowns back. And now we have 3 points left. In terms of damage, there's only one real talent here that would give us any damage, and that's Time Manipulation, but I'll kind of go into that later when I'm talking about the M+ talents. Otherwise, generally, I'd probably recommend going into Dragon's Breath. This is an AoE stun. Very useful for mages. We don't really have a form of AoE stun other than Blast Wave now, but Dragon's Breath is pretty much the primary use for these last 3 talents. More damage-wise, if you are focused a lot more for damage, would go 2 points in Time Manipulation and then a point in Freezing Cold. So that's all the things for the general tree. Like I said, after you get down with the majority of the talents here, most of these talents here are utility. The only ones that really matter for damage are Overflowing Energy, Rune, Tome, and both Tomes, and then Ice Nova. All the other talents are all utility based. They are all for your defensives, any utility that Mage brings. None of the other talents in these first two areas matter about your damage. And like I said, once you get those, you can just go into Temporal Warp, Shifting Power, and I would recommend Dragon's Breath just for general cases. And so for crafted gear, the crafted gear that I would recommend for Frost Mages would be Elemental Lariat, which seems to be a BIS craft for almost all classes and specs. This is very good for basically everyone, just because of the embellishment that it has on it. And then a Mice of the Blue. Those are our two currently best embellishments. There are some cases where the Azure Weave set is simming better. So the Azure Weave set is a two-piece set that on feet, robe, and shoulders. So obviously it replaces a tier piece. This seems to be simming slightly better at the higher item level. So when you're actually getting close to BIS gear, this seems to be simming slightly better. But in my personal opinion, it's not really worth it. A Mice of the Blue and Elemental Lariat are very safe bets for embellished gear for Frost Mages. Otherwise, just for crafted gear in general, after you get your two embellishments with Lariat and Mice of the Blue, I would primarily go with a weapon, either a main hand offhand combo or a staff. This gives you options to... The main hand offhand combo gives you a lot of different options to upgrade. You can, if you use that combo, you basically have 3 different upgrade paths. You can either get an upgraded main hand, an upgraded offhand, or an upgraded staff. So I would recommend this. I personally went with the main hand offhand, and I got a main hand in my vault, and I still am currently wearing my crafted offhand. Other than that, once you have those 2 other crafts, you have 1 remaining craft with the 5 sparks. This is basically you just want to fill out your lowest item level pieces. So for me, since I only had 1 with the offhand, I still had 2 left, so I ended up crafting a ring. And I crafted feet, which were my 2 lowest item levels, and I'm still wearing them. So these last few pieces of the crafted gear really don't matter where you put them. It's just really filling out your lowest item level pieces. Now for gear and trinkets that Frost Mages should aim for, we should aim for, trinket-wise, the Whispering Incarnate icon in the raid is one of the best ones. So that drops in the Primal Council. That's one of everybody's best trinkets. Otherwise, for Frost Mages, I would highly recommend going for the Furious Rage Feather, which is a drop from the Nakuda Offensive. Eye of the Skullvald, which drops from Halls of Valor. It's a very low drop chance, but it's fairly good. Other ones that you could go for if you need it: the Infernal Writ from Court of Stars. The Shadow Gem you could use, but primarily the main thing that you really just want to be going for at this point is looking for item level. There's not really too many actual BIS trinkets for Frost Mage. It's really uncommon for us to have like major BIS trinkets because of how our class is set up. We don't really have like a burst window, so on uses aren't really great for us, or they aren't really as good as they are for other classes. So mainly in this case, just look to go for item level. I kind of want to go a little bit more into the Lariat. The main thing you need to know about the Lariat embellishment is, as it says, your spells and abilities have a chance to empower one of your socketed elemental gems, granting 551 of their associated stat for 12 seconds. So how this works is it bases that proc off of the type of gems that you have in your sockets. And so for all of my gems, I have the Earth Gems, which have... The Earth Gems will give you a Mastery proc from the Lariat. So this will be, in this case, I have a Crit Mastery gem, and then a Haste Mastery gem. In my ring, I have another Crit Mastery, and then a Crit Mastery. So you want to make sure that all of your gems are the same type. So again, all of these are the Earth type of gem, as the Lariat, like I said, bases the proc off of which type of gems you have. So this will always give me the Earth proc. And Lariat does seem to have a relatively decent uptime. If I look at my latest key, the Lariat uptime was 32%, which is obviously a good baseline. you know, something that you don't have to worry anything about, and you just have a 32% buff. So that's very good. I would always recommend really going for the mastery proc. You can sim it, which obviously I would recommend. It might not always sim the best for you to go for the mastery, but currently mastery is one of our best stats, which now it kind of leads me into our stat priority. Frost Mage, or basically our stat prio kind of switched from Shadowlands with it being like crit haste, to now in Dragonflight our stat priority is crit mastery. Mastery used to be like our worst stat, and now it's our best stat. So I would always recommend mastery for going for secondary stats. After mastery, I would go crit, although crit and haste are pretty similar, but I would mainly go for the crit. And then I would go for a relatively decent amount of haste, and then versus kind of the last one. So in terms of stat prio, it's mastery over everything. Well, intellect over mastery over crit and haste are pretty similar, and then those over verse. But that's obviously something that you should sim. Everybody's stats differ based on what gear you currently have, so that could be slightly different. So now I kind of wanted to go into our single target talents and the options we kind of have there. So obviously we just get Ice Lance off the bat. We do end up having to take all 3 talents at the beginning, including Blizzard, even in single target, just because that's the only way we can get Icy Veins. So going down, we get Flurry, we get Brain Freeze, we get Shatter, and we get Piercing Cold. So those are kind of just the guaranteed ones that we need for those 8 points at the beginning. After this, we just go Cold Snap. We do go Lonely Winter. It's still better than having a Water Elemental. We go Everlasting Frost, Perpetual Winter, Frozen Touch. We go 2 points in Wintertide, and then we finally get Icy Veins. We get Bone Chilling, we get Flash Freeze, and then we get 2 points in Splintering Cold. And now from here on out, we have 10 talents points to fill out the rest of our tree. We basically need to get Thermal Void down here, and Icy Propulsion, which kind of leads to how our spec is run currently. So going down Icy Propulsion and Thermal Void. We want to use this bottom right side of the tree to get Splitting Ice and Hailstones. Now these talents, especially Hailstones, Splintering Cold, and Flash Freeze, are all incredibly good just based on our mastery, because a lot of these are dealing with how icicles are doing damage, and icicles scale off of our mastery. So now we have 4 points left. So these points are going to be used primarily for our Frost Bolts. We use Slick Ice, obviously, and then we use Snap Freeze for 2 points. And these last 2 points are kind of dependent on the fight. In pure single target, 2 points in Deep Shatter will sim the best. It's not always as practical, and it's not as easy to play the double Deep Shatter build. For people who are rather new to Frost Mage, I wouldn't really recommend 2 Deep Shatter until you're very comfortable with the spec. But safe wise, I would recommend going a point in Deep Shatter and a point in Freezing Winds. This gives you a lot of leeway in your window. Freezing Winds will always give you your Fingers of Frost procs. And so now I'm kind of got to go over why we needed to do this path in the tree. These left-hand side talents, Glacial Assault, which basically just gives our Flurry a chance to call down a damage, an AoE damage, doesn't sim very well. Comet Storm, it's very hard to get to Comet Storm with Mastery being so good. We just don't really have the points to talent into it. And then Fractured Frost, these talents are really only AoE based, and they also just aren't good with how good our other portions of our tree are in terms of mastery. One thing that I did want to point out for Frost Mages that differs from Shadowlands that it does to Dragonflight is the usage of Flurry and Brain Freeze. So prior to Dragonflight, Flurry used to be a casted ability. It had a cast time, and the only time that would be an instant cast is when you get a Brain Freeze proc. As of Dragonflight, as of 10.0, Flurry is now an instant cast, and you now have 2 charges of Flurry. So before, you would only cast Flurry if you had a Brain Freeze proc. That's changed now in Dragonflight. You now basically use Flurry no matter whether you have a proc or not. The Brain Freeze proc does not matter in terms of when you actually use a Flurry or not. It's just an additional damage modifier. So Brain Freeze basically just gives a Frostbolt our chance to reset the cooldown on Flurry, and it also makes our Flurry do more damage. Like I said, It has no effect on our actual rotation, whether we get a proc or not. It's just more additional damage. So now for our single target rotation, we follow basically this guide here. For single target, we always want to have Icy Veins on cooldown. We always want Rune on cooldown, or Rune of Power on cooldown. We want Frozen Orb on cooldown. And then we want to always use Flurry if your last spell was a Frostbolt. So this is the Shatter combo, which I will talk about in the single target rotation. You want to use Ice Lance if you have either Fingers of Frost procs or Winter's Chill on your target. After that, for priority, you would use Shifting Power while not affected by a rune. So this would primarily happen somewhere around 25 seconds into the fight. You would be casting Shifting Power after your hard-casted Rune of Power ends. And then your last single target priority is Frostbolt. Frostbolt's your filler for everything. Now, for our single target rotation, it's always going to be based on what procs we have. So we always want Icy Veins, Rune, and Frozen Orb on cooldown as much as possible. Once you get those three on cooldown, which Icy Veins and Rune... Icy Veins should always be on cooldown. You should always be in Icy Veins if possible. And then Rune will always be casted. There's no real time we want to save Rune or Frozen Orb. After that, our whole rotation will be based upon the procs we get. And all of our procs will be based upon our Frostbolts. So Frostbolts will always be used as filler in our single target rotation. And Frostbolts can grant us both Fingers of Frost procs, which is when we would use our Ice Lance, or they can give us flurries. Now, no matter if you have a Brain Freeze proc on your flurries or not, whenever you cast a Frostbolt, if you have a flurry proc available, you will always send your flurry proc after your Frostbolt. And the reasoning for this is the way that flurry works, if you read the ability, it launches a flurry of ice at the target 3 times. Each hit will reduce their movement speed, which doesn't really matter, but the main thing that matters is it applies a Winter's Chill to the target. And Winter's Chill, how that acts, is it causes the target to take damage from your spells as if it were frozen. And this is the main portion that matters with Frost Mages, is we want all of our spells to be hitting the target as if they were frozen. That's based on the Shatter that we get from our tree. So this is why crit is relatively important to Frost Mages, but not too important. But for single target, we always want to be shattering as many of our spells as possible. So that's why when we cast Frostbolt, we immediately follow it with a casted Flurry, because Winter's Chill can only stack up to 2 charges. It can only stack twice on your target. So since it sends 3 flurries of ice at the enemy and hits them 3 times, you would technically have 3 stacks of Winter's Chill, but you're wasting one if you don't have anything beforehand. So you want to Frostbolt into a Flurry, which Flurry actually has a faster travel time than Frostbolt does, which I'll show you here in a sec. So what will happen is when you do Frostbolt into Flurry, the first and second Flurry stacks will hit the target, giving you 2 stacks of Winter's Chill. Then your Frostbolt will hit the target, dropping the Winter's Chill stacks to 1. And then the third hit of Flurry will hit the target, bringing your Winter's Chill stacks back up to 2. After this happens, you always want to go into Ice Lancing your target afterwards. So you always want to use your Ice Lance into the Winter's Chill procs on your target. That's basically the single target rotation. I'll be showing you a really slow version of the single target rotation to make it really simple. I'm going to do like a slow and explained one of when I'm getting procs and what I'm using and why I'm doing them in the places that I am. And then I'm going to do a normal speed one showing you like full speed what it should look like. So starting off, Ice Lance, or Icy Veins, you get a Fingers of Frost proc and a Flurry proc. You want to use your Fingers of Frost, followed by Frostbolt into your Flurry combo. So I did a Frostbolt. You can also see my recently casted spells in the bottom left. I have no procs, Frostbolt, Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. Now my Rune of Power is gone. I cast Rune of Power, And you can have Frozen Orb. I should have casted Frozen Orb earlier, but just since I'm explaining it, I was a little behind. But now, since I have Freezing Winds currently talented, I'm spending my Fingers of Frost procs every time the proc shows up. Now I have no procs. I go into a Frostbolt with the Flurry combo, followed by 2 Ice Lances. Now I'm out of all my procs, so I'm using Shifting Power. And I just continue this rotation. So Frostbolt, I got a Flurry proc, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. No procs, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. I have Rune of Power, cast Rune of Power. I have a Fingers of Frost proc, which I'm now using. I'm going to use that, followed by just Frostbolt Filler. Now I got a Flurry proc, so I cast Frostbolt into Flurry, into 2 Ice Lances. Now my Frozen Orb's up. I send Frozen Orb, and now I'm using my Fingers of Frost procs. I'm using those. When you don't have a Fingers of Frost proc, you automatically start a Frostbolt cast, whether or not you have a Flurry charge or not, and you continue this. So now that I kind of just did a slow and explained one, I will be doing a normal speed. I will do a commentary for it for the beginning portion, and then I'll kind of just go into just the gameplay, how it would be normally. So start off, Frostbolt Flurry, Icy Veins, 2 Ice Lances, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances, Frostbolt, Rune of Power's done, cast Rune of Power. I have Fingers of Frost, use it, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances, Frozen Orb's up, send Frozen Orb. Now I use my Fingers of Frost procs, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. Keep using Fingers of Frost, Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. 2 Ice Lances. Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. Shifting Power, since it's on cooldown, and everything else is on cooldown. Continue the rotation. And now I'm just going to be going at it without the commentary here to show you what it would look like. The main thing with the Frost rotation is that you always want to be casting. There is never a time where you never don't want to be casting. You always have something to be casting. I'll go back into the commentary. Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. Filler Frostbolt, Filler Frostbolt. Rune of Power's up, Rune of Power, Frostbolt, Frostbolt, Frostbolt. You'll get periods of times like that where you have no procs. Frostbolt Flurry, 2 Ice Lances. There is one little min-maxy thing that you can do, which I'll explain here once my Icy Veins ends. Just 5 seconds. But okay, so the min-maxy thing that I kind of want to say regards around Shifting Power. If you're just starting Frost Mage, I wouldn't really recommend getting into this. And it's whenever you have a Flurry charge, which, let me get one. You send it like you normally do with the Frostbolt combo. You Ice Lance once, and then you use Shifting Power while there's still a Winter's Chill on the target. Shifting Power actually uses the Winter's Chill and gets the increased critical strike chance from it, but doesn't actually take the stack. It doesn't use the Winter's Chill stack. So that's why you'll see Frost Mages do the Frostbolt Flurry combo and do 1 Ice Lance into Shifting Power, and then using that second Ice Lance, because Shifting Power gets a gain off of the Winter's Chill, but doesn't actually use the proc. Alright, so now that the single target's kind of been explained, and the basics of it, the only thing I didn't really talk about with single target is you really use Lust on cooldown, use Time Warp on cooldown. There's no real time for Frost to hold it. And then when you are running Temporal Warp, Frost Mage does not want to stack the lusts, whereas Fire and Arcane do. For Frost Mage, you want to stagger them. So you would have your first lust for 40 seconds, and then once that first lust ends, you would lust again, and you'd get lust again for another 40 seconds. Frost never wants to stack them. Now for M+ talents, there are a few things that'll change. So the few things that'll change for M+ talents is you basically get rid of part of the left side of the tree. So you wouldn't take Deep Shatter. Oh, I'm still in combat. Let me get out of combat real quick. Okay. You wouldn't take Deep Shatter, and you wouldn't take Frozen Touch. And now that you have this for M+, you always take Ice Collar now, and you always take Freezing Rain. Those are the two talents in M+ that you always take with each. That's the main difference that you don't take in single target, where you do an M+ is those two talents, Ice Collar and Freezing Rain. And now after this, you are again splitting ice into Hailstones, Icy Propulsion, Snap Freeze, Freezing Winds, Chain Reaction, and Thermal Void. Now, after this last talent kind of depends on what you're doing, what kind of key you're doing. There are only 3 talents that Frost Mages can basically change in M+. Currently, the talent tree that I'm in now is a little bit more single target focused. So this would be the kind of tree that you would use on Tyrannica weeks. So this is the tree that I'm currently using this week. The only 3 talents that you can use to swap things around with would be you would swap Slick Ice with Frostbite, which Frostbite basically just gives all your chill effects a 10% chance to freeze the target. So this gives Blizzard, Frozen Orb, Frostbolt, Flurry, all your things chances to actually freeze the target. Cone of Cold, all of those. So that's really good for fortified weeks. Again, a lot more AoE focused going Frostbite versus Slick Ice. These are the 2 talents you would change back and forth. The second talent that you would change back and forth for M+ would be changing Splintering Cold with Sub-Zero. Now, the only time you ever go Sub-Zero is if you're talented into Frostbite, because Sub-Zero increases your frost spells damage to targets that are rooted and frozen. And there's a common misconception that it's just like whether they're frozen or rooted, but the main thing you need to know is it's rooted and frozen. So they need to be considered frozen and rooted at the same time. So this can never happen to bosses, which is why it's really bad for Tyrannical and for Raid, because bosses can never get frozen. So that's why you typically just go the Splintering Cold. But fortified weeks, it's possible to go Sub-Zero for certain keys. The third talent that you would change would be you would change Wintertide with Snowstorm. Now, Snowstorm, it makes it so that Blizzard has a chance to increase the damage of your next Cone of Cold by 10%. I think it actually ends up being 20% once you get the 2 procs into it. So now building a full AoE spec, it would look more like this. So it's basically these 2 talents are the only 2 things that swap back and forth. Frostbite and Slick Ice swap back and forth, and then Sub-Zero and Splintering Cold swap back and forth. Those are the only 3 things in M+ that you really have the options to swap. Everything else in our tree is so rigid based on it either being tuned poorly or it just not working with how well Mastery and Hailstones currently is. So now going into our M+ rotation. Or basically the M+, the priority for AoE. So same thing starting out as single target. You always want to use Icy Veins on cooldown. You want to use Rune when you don't have your Rune from Icy Veins. You want to use Frozen Orb. And you want to use Blizzard. Those are the main things you really need to worry about for AoE. The other things are kind of somewhat of like fillers. But in AoE, your main priorities are always keeping uptime on Blizzard and Frozen Orb, and getting as much uptime as you can on Icy Veins and Root of Power. After those, you want to deal with the Ice Lances with Fingers of Frost or Winter's Chill. So these are the ones that you'll be getting from your Frozen Orb uptime. The priority after Ice Lance would be Flurry, and this is a Flurry not getting shattered from Frostbolt. Shifting Power, basically just for CDR on both Orb, Blizzard, Rune, and Icy Veins. and Flurry. Shifting Power gives you CDR, gives you your cooldowns back for all of these spells that are of a higher priority, which again is why Shifting Power is so good for us. Ice Nova, which is part of the general tree. There's currently somewhat, I'm not sure if it's really a bug or how it's intended, but Ice Nova currently does a lot of damage in AoE. It's not really getting reduced. It's supposed to be reduced after 8 targets, I believe. Yeah, reduced among 8 damage to all other enemies within 8 yards. And I think it is reduced. It's just not reduced to the point it normally is. But Ice Nova is currently very good in AoE, followed by Frostbolt as a filler. Technically, Arcane Explosion is higher than Frostbolt in the AoE priority, but the main downside to using Arcane Explosion is it doesn't benefit from Icy Veins, or it doesn't benefit from Icy Propulsion, whereas Frostbolt can actually gain us procs, which help us benefit for Icy Propulsion. So another thing that I wanted to go into as to the differences between what happened with Shadowlands and Dragonflight is Icy Propulsion now is only your single target spells critical hits reduce the cooldown of Icy Veins. So this was a major change from Shadowlands because it used to be all spells and not just the single target spells. So that's why Arcane Explosion got a lot less of a priority in AoE compared to just Frostbolt, because Frostbolt has the chance to get us procs and it actually can benefit on Icy Propulsion, whereas Frozen Orb, Blizzard, Ice Nova, and Arcane Explosion cannot. And so now I'll kind of go over some M+ gameplay. I'll do the same thing I did with single target. I'll do like a slow and explained one at the start, and then I'll go normal speed with how it'll look just normally. So always in AoE, if you can start out with the pre-casted Blizzard. So I'll do that. Blizzard, and do an Icy Veins, followed by Frozen Orb. You always want to get those on cooldown as soon as possible. And then you always want to cast Blizzard as soon as it comes off cooldown. Other than that, you follow the priority list. So I'm just going into Blizzard. Frozen Orb's off cooldown, sending Frozen Orb. Now my Rune's gone. I cast Rune into my Blizzard. Now I'm just sending my Fingers of Frost procs that I'm getting from my Frozen Orb. Sending another Blizzard because it's off cooldown. Our main thing in AoE is just you want as constant uptime as you can on Blizzard and on Frozen Orb as possible. And that's really the main thing with Frost AoE is you literally just want as much uptime as you can on those two things. It's going to be a little harder to keep uptime on Icy Veins and AoE than it is in single target, just because you're not having as many flurries, you do still have your Ice Lances, but a lot of your globals are getting spent into Frozen Orb and Blizzard, whereas all of your globals in single target are getting spent in Frostbolts and your flurry combos and everything like that. So now I'll kind of go into a normal speed one. I'll still be commentating some, but again, 100% Blizzard uptime if you can. Sending your Fingers of Frost procs. Frozen Orbs on cooldown, send it. Blizzard off. I'm going to Ice Nova, just because you actually... I've been Ice Novaing basically on cooldown in AoE packs. Technically, I believe it sims better at 5 target to be sending Ice Nova, but I'm not positive at that number. I'm only been sending Ice Nova when I know that I'm not going to get overcaps on Fingers of Frost, because again, that's a high priority. You don't want to overcap on any of your things. Playing Frost Mage, you're obviously going to cap. You're going to munch some of your procs, but it's obviously to our best interest to try and not cap. And now everything's on cooldown. I send Shifting Power after I get another Flurry or another Blizzard out. So you see Shifting Power gets both Rune, Frozen Orb, it gets everything on cooldown. There is one bug that happens with AoE. It's happened since Shadowlands, and it's very irritating to deal with. If you have another orb currently out when you cast your second orb, the Freezing Winds doesn't actually recognize your second orb, and so you won't get the Fingers of Frost procs from Freezing Winds that you would normally. This really only happens in mass AoE. It's not happening right now in this 5-target AoE, but it will happen in mass AoE. But as you can see, Frost is doing relatively good AoE damage. AoE is one of our strong suits. 5-target is not one of our greatest ones. We really shine in mass AoE and single target. Those are our two really strong suits. We really lack in anywhere between like 3 and 6 target count. Our single target currently is simming as the best single target in the game. That's obviously without externals, but it's still currently simming as the best single target, and that's obviously if we go down, we take away our AOE talents and run the pure single target, which is this. Oh, dropping the snowstorm. Obviously. Almost forgot about that. Which is this. Just kidding. It's... Why am I missing a talent somewhere? Oh, I'm missing 2 in hailstones. Oops. It's this. This is the pure single target. We are one of the strongest performing classes in this, especially without externals. Obviously, there is a little bit of a downside with Frost, and we struggle a little bit from movement. But we do have movement mobility choices. We have Shimmer. We have Ice Flows. I typically like Ice Flows better, but again, that's personal choice. And then single target we're very strong in, and then very mass AoE, which, again, the build for mass AoE is this. So yeah, that's just the basic Frost Mage guide with a little bit of commentary on single target gameplay, a little slow and explained, and a little bit more normal speed, as well as our rotations and talents, and then going into our M+ talents, the options that we have in M+, our rotation, and then again the M+ gameplay, a little bit slow and explained, followed by a normal speed AoE scenario. The only time that I'd really recommend the full AoE build would be on Fortified Weeks in Keys, and on Primal Council, the raid fight. Those are the only ones I'd really recommend the full AoE build in. The only ones I would recommend taking Snowstorm in, Algathar Academy is a very good key to run Snowstorm in. It's basically mass AoE pull after mass AoE pull after mass AoE pull. Very good for us to use it in, especially like the tree boss area. It's where we really shine. I'm sure if you guys are watching this video, you've seen Frost Mages just absolutely slam on Algathar, especially in the tree area and on the tree boss, just because of how good our mass AoE is. You could also run it in like Halls of Valor and Nakud. Those are the other two ones that you could possibly run it in, but again, always depends on what key level and what week it is. If it's Tyrannical, I wouldn't recommend running Snowstorm. Fortified is the only time I'd ever really recommend going the full AoE build. But yeah, that is my Frost Mage guide for Dragonflight. I'll be looking to update this if there's any more changes to Frost Mage. We are somewhat hoping that there will be some changes to our tree, because making our entire left side of the tree not even possible to talent into, and, Glacial Spike still being one of our capstones, still being a damage loss to even talent it into it, doesn't really feel great. Our tree feels very rigid, and we don't really have many options to work around. But yeah, Frost Mage is in a relatively decent spot. We've been on basically 3 straight buffs. I think we got buffs to Frostbolt, Flurry, and Ice Lance a few times ago, and then our last one we got a buff to, I think it was like we got our Splitting Ice nerf reverted, we got our Icicle damage buffed, and I think it was another Frostbolt buff, and then this last buff was just basically a 5% aura buff. Obviously, I'm not ever going to complain about buffs, and I'm hoping, the only major downside with our buffs is it just made us better in the spots that we're good at, and didn't really change anything in the spots we're bad at. Like I talked about before, we're very good in pure single target with our pure single target build, and we're very good in mass AoE. the parts that we struggle is anywhere from like 3 to like 6 targets. That's kind of our weak spot, and a lot of other classes will outshine us in that area. But yeah, that's all for my Frost Mage guide. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave comments, and I'll be happy to answer them. I'm always hanging around in the Mage Discord and Alter Time and Frost. I'm happy to answer any questions, but other than that, thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you guys enjoyed the guide.